The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the comforting quiet of a peaceful night. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl from the shadows of the living room. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. My dog, Max, stood in the corner, his body rigid, his glowing eyes locked onto something I couldn't see. That's when I realized he wasn't growling at me. He was growling at whatever else was in the room with us. But then, Max stirred. It wasn't the usual sleepy stretch or repositioning we were used to. His ears perked up, eyes snapping open, and he let out a low, guttural growl that made every hair on my body stand on end. I glanced at him, alarmed. His eyes, those warm, familiar brown eyes, looked different, darker, almost black. "Mama," Mia whispered, clutching her book tightly. "Max is scaring me." I forced a nervous laugh, trying to convince both her and myself that it was nothing. "It's probably just a squirrel outside," I said, getting up to check. But as I reached the window, Max's growl deepened, a sound so unnatural it seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. I turned to him, and my heart dropped. He was staring directly at Mia, his lips curled back to reveal sharp, glistening teeth. That night was the first time I realized something was terribly wrong with Max. After dinner, as we settled into our nightly routine, Max began pacing. He moved through the house with an unsettling urgency, his claws clicking against the hardwood floors. His head was low, his eyes darting to every corner as if he were tracking something unseen. I called out to him, "Max, come here, boy." But he didn't respond. Instead, he froze mid-step in the hallway, his body rigid, head slowly turning toward the darkened end of the corridor. His growl returned, low and menacing. Mia peeked out from her bedroom. "What's he looking at?" she asked timidly. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't see anything, but Max's gaze was fixed, unblinking, as if something invisible stood just beyond our sight. Suddenly, he lunged forward, snapping his jaws at the air. The sound of his teeth clashing together echoed through the hallway, and Mia screamed. "Max, stop!" I yelled, rushing toward him. But the moment I stepped closer, he whipped around, his snarl directed at me. His posture was completely alien, his body tense, his eyes blazing with a feral intensity. For a split second, I thought he was going to attack me. Then, just as quickly as it started, he stopped. He shook his head violently, as though trying to shake something off, and whimpered softly. His tail dropped between his legs, and he slunk away to his bed, leaving me and Mia frozen in fear. The first attack was only the beginning. That night, long after Mia had gone to bed, I was woken by the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from the door. Slow, deliberate scratching, like claws dragging across wood. "Max?" I called out hesitantly. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping toward the door. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened it, Max was sitting there, staring up at me. But this wasn't the dog I knew. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and his expression was chillingly blank. Without warning, he lunged. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the attack never came. He stopped inches from me, his mouth open in a silent snarl. Then, as if restrained by an invisible force, he slowly backed away, his body twitching unnaturally. That was when I noticed the shadows. They weren't normal shadows cast by my flashlight. These were darker, denser, writhing on the walls as if alive. They seemed to reach toward Max, wrapping around him like tendrils. He let out a tortured howl, a sound so heart-wrenching it didn't even sound like it came from an animal. I slammed the door shut, barricading myself inside. My heart pounded in my chest as Max's howls echoed through the house, mingling with Mia's terrified cries from her bedroom. By the next morning, Max seemed different. His usual playful demeanor was gone, replaced by a tense, almost predatory air. He followed Mia everywhere, his gaze never leaving her. It was as if he were waiting for something, I decided to take him to the vet, hoping for a logical explanation. But as soon as we arrived, Max's behavior became even more erratic. He refused to leave the car, growling and snapping at anyone who came near. The vet couldn't examine him, and I left feeling more hopeless than ever. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamt of Max standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes glowing like embers, his mouth moving as though he were speaking, but no sound came out. Behind him, a shadowy figure loomed, its elongated fingers resting on his back. I woke up drenched in sweat, only to find Max sitting outside my door, staring at me through the crack with those same glowing eyes. Mia's screams woke me in the dead of night, her voice sharp and panicked. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding. The hallway seemed unnaturally long, as if the house itself was stretching, pulling me away from her. When I reached her door, it was ajar, the faint sound of growling coming from inside. "Mia!" I shouted, pushing the door open. The scene froze me in place. Max was standing at the foot of Mia's bed, his body rigid and shaking. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, locked onto Mia, who had pressed herself against the headboard, clutching her stuffed rabbit. The room was cold, colder than it had any right to be in the middle of summer. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. "Max!" I yelled, my voice trembling. He didn't flinch, didn't even look at me. Instead, his head tilted unnaturally, almost upside down, his growl turning into a deep, guttural snarl. Then, he lunged. "Mama!" Mia screamed. I threw myself between them, grabbing Max mid-leap. His strength was inhuman. He twisted violently in my arms, his jaws snapping inches from my face. I could feel the heat of his breath, the raw power in his muscles, as I wrestled him to the ground. "Mia, run! Go to the bathroom and lock the door!" I screamed. She hesitated for a moment, frozen in fear, before bolting past us. Max roared, a sound so unearthly it made my ears ring. With one final push, I managed to shove him out of the room and slam the door shut. His claws scraped against the wood, the sound grating and relentless. When morning came, I found scratches on the door. Not claw marks. No, these were different. They were deliberate, almost like symbols, carved deep into the wood. I couldn't decipher them, but they radiated an unsettling energy that made my skin crawl. Max was nowhere to be found. The house was eerily silent, the oppressive cold from the night before still lingering. I found Mia curled up in the bathtub, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face streaked with tears. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, pulling her into my arms. But I didn't believe my own words. Later that day, Max returned as if nothing had happened. He trotted in through the back door, his tail wagging lazily, his eyes back to their normal brown. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream. But when I bent down to pet him, his lips twitched into a brief, unnatural snarl. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to remind me that whatever had happened last night wasn't over. Desperate for answers, I turned to Father Daniels, a local priest known for his knowledge of the occult. He listened intently as I described Max's behavior, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Animals are sensitive to spirits," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, your dog isn't just possessed. It's being used as a vessel by something far more dangerous." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "What do I do?" He hesitated. "There are rituals, prayers. But if the entity has taken root, expelling it could be dangerous." "What kind of dangerous?" I pressed. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It won't leave willingly, and when it feels threatened, it will retaliate. You need to protect your daughter at all costs." He handed me a small vial of holy water and a rosary. "Place this in your home. Pray every night. But be careful, it will fight back." That night, I did as Father Daniels instructed. I placed the rosary on the mantle and sprinkled holy water in every corner of the house. As I moved through the rooms, I could feel the air growing heavier, the shadows deepening. When I reached Max's bed, he was watching me, his eyes following my every move. I sprinkled the holy water near him, and he recoiled with a guttural snarl. His body twisted unnaturally, his legs bending at impossible angles as he backed away. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. The house was plunged into darkness, and I heard a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Mama!" Mia's voice called from somewhere in the dark. "Mama, where are you?" My blood ran cold. It wasn't her. I knew it wasn't her. Mia was asleep in her room. I had just checked on her. The growl grew louder, closer, as the shadows around me seemed to move. I clutched the rosary tightly, whispering a prayer under my breath. Suddenly, Max lunged out of the darkness, his eyes glowing red, his mouth open wide as if to bite. I threw the vial of holy water at him, and he let out a piercing, otherworldly scream. The shadows recoiled, the room erupting into chaos as objects flew off shelves and the walls seemed to shudder. The next day, I called Father Daniels, begging him to come to the house. When he arrived, he took one look at Max and paled. "This is worse than I thought," he said. He set up an altar in the living room, lighting candles and reciting prayers in Latin. Max growled from the corner, his body trembling as though fighting against invisible chains. The exorcism was a nightmare. The moment Father Daniels began, Max let out a blood-curdling howl, his body convulsing violently. The shadows returned, swirling around the room, knocking over furniture and extinguishing the candles. "Mama!" Mia screamed, running into the room. I grabbed her, holding her tightly as the chaos unfolded. Father Daniels pressed on, his voice steady despite the mounting terror. Max's body twisted unnaturally, his eyes rolling back as black, inky liquid began to seep from his mouth. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the windows. With one final prayer, there was a deafening roar, and Max collapsed. The shadows disappeared, the room falling silent. The days after the exorcism felt surreal, as if we were walking through a dream, or a nightmare that refused to end. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a hollow shell. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, sent my heart racing. Even with the demon seemingly gone, its presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder of what had happened. Max wasn't the same. My once loyal companion, who had slept at the foot of my bed for years, now avoided me entirely. He no longer wagged his tail or brought me his favorite toy. Instead, he stayed curled up in the corner of the living room, his back to the room, his eyes distant and empty. He wouldn't even look at Mia, the little girl he used to follow everywhere like a guardian. I tried everything, coaxing him with treats, sitting beside him for hours, whispering to him that it was okay. But Max remained withdrawn, his body tense, flinching at every sound. At night, his whimpers echoed through the house, as though he were haunted by memories only he could see. Mia struggled too. The once bright light in her eyes had dimmed. She no longer slept in her room, instead curling up in my bed every night, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly it seemed like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She wouldn't even say Max's name anymore. One morning, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The strange symbols that had appeared on Mia's door the night of the attack were gone. Or so I had thought. A faint outline of them remained, burned into the wood, visible only when the light hit it at a certain angle. I tried scrubbing them away, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had been scarred by the demon's presence. Over time, I began to notice similar marks in other parts of the house, on the walls, the floors, even the mirrors. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. One night, as I stared at the marks, tracing their jagged edges with my fingers, I felt a sudden, icy breath against my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. The first time I heard the scratching again, I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a branch against the window. But deep down, I knew better. It started faintly, just a soft scraping sound coming from the walls at night. Then it grew louder, more deliberate. One night, I woke to find Mia standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and glassy. "Mia," I whispered, sitting up. She didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the door, her tiny frame trembling. "It's in the walls," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I pulled her into my arms, trying to comfort her, but my own fear was too great. The scratching grew louder, echoing through the room. I held her close, praying under my breath until the sounds finally stopped. Max began acting strangely again. He would stand in the middle of the room, staring at the corners where the shadows gathered. His ears would perk up, and he'd let out a low, guttural growl. Sometimes, he would pace the house at night, his claws clicking against the hardwood floors, his movements restless and erratic. One night, I woke to find him sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me. His eyes, those warm brown eyes I had loved so much, were filled with fear. He let out a low whine, his head lowering as if in apology, and then he walked out of the room. The next morning, Max was gone. I searched the entire house, the yard, even the woods nearby, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I found myself wondering if he had left to protect us, or if the demon had finally taken him completely. Months passed, but the fear never left. Mia and I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but every shadow felt like a threat, every creak a warning. I reached out to Father Daniels again, asking him if the demon could ever return. His answer was far from comforting. Demons are cunning, he said. They don't give up easily. Even when exorcised, their influence can linger. They watch, they wait, and when they find a moment of weakness, they strike again. His words haunted me. Every night, as I lay awake listening to the silence of the house, I wondered if the demon was still there, lurking in the corners, waiting for its chance to come back. It happened on one of those nights where everything felt too still, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making every little sound feel amplified. Mia had fallen asleep in my bed again, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly it looked like its seams might burst. I stayed awake, as I often did now, unable to let my guard down. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft, deliberate scratching. Not on the door this time. This was different. It was coming from the wall directly behind me. The sound sent an icy chill down my spine. I turned slowly, my breath hitching, and reached for the flashlight on my nightstand. As I clicked it on, the beam illuminated the wall. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then, as I got closer, I noticed it. Jagged, uneven lines carved deep into the paint, the grooves still fresh and raw. I traced them with my fingers, the faint scent of burnt wood lingering in the air. The word, soon, stared back at me, the letters crooked and menacing, as if clawed into the wall by something that didn't belong in this world. A sudden creak from the hallway made me whip around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam danced across the open doorway, illuminating the dark corridor beyond. The air was heavier now, colder, and I could feel the faint vibration of something moving, something I couldn't see. "Mama!" Mia's sleepy voice startled me, pulling me back into the moment. She was sitting up in bed, her wide eyes darting toward the door. "Stay here," I whispered, trying to sound braver than I felt. I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The scratching started again, louder this time, coming from the far end of the hallway near Mia's room. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move forward. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until it felt like I was walking into a freezer. My breath fogged in front of me, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. When I reached Mia's door, I saw it. Another mark, fresh and gleaming as though it had just been carved. But this one wasn't a word. It was a symbol, jagged and angular, radiating an energy that made my stomach churn. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers grazed the surface, the lights in the house flickered violently before plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, I heard them, whispers, soft at first, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, their tones sharp and guttural. "Mama!" Mia's terrified scream came from the bedroom, breaking through the cacophony. I bolted back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The door to the bedroom was now shut, though I hadn't closed it. My flashlight flickered weakly as I reached for the handle, my hands trembling. "Mia, open the door," I yelled, twisting the knob, but it wouldn't budge. From the other side, I could hear her sobbing, her cries muffled by the sound of something dragging across the floor. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling my head until I thought my skull might split. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled into the room. Mia was huddled in the corner, her face buried in her stuffed rabbit, but the room wasn't empty. At first, it was just a shadow, a tall, impossibly thin figure standing in the far corner, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and its elongated fingers ended in razor-sharp claws that tapped rhythmically against the wall. I froze, the flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor, its beam casting erratic shadows around the room. The creature's head snapped toward me, its movements jerky and inhuman. "Mama!" Mia whimpered, her voice trembling. The thing moved then, not walking but gliding, its dark form distorting and shifting as it came closer. The air around it was suffocating, heavy with a malevolence that made my knees buckle. I grabbed Mia and backed toward the door, my hands fumbling for the rosary around my neck. "Leave us alone," I screamed, holding the cross out in front of me. The entity stopped, its head tilting again, as if curious. Then it let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that grew into a piercing shriek. The windows shattered, the shards of glass scattering like rain. When the entity finally vanished, the room was left in disarray. The walls were covered in deep scratches, symbols carved with precision and malice. One of the marks caught my eye, a large, circular design etched into the center of the floor. It pulsed faintly, the lines glowing with an eerie red light. Mia clung to me, sobbing, as I backed us out of the room. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this was no longer just a haunting. The demon wasn't simply trying to scare us. It was leaving its mark, claiming the house, preparing for something far worse. I called Father Daniels that night, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. His silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "It's not done with you," he said finally. "This isn't just a haunting anymore. It's a battle for your soul and your daughters. You need to leave that house. Now." But even as he said the words, I knew it was too late. The demon had already claimed us, and no matter where we went, it would follow. The final sign wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Soon,